This week, we're going to focus on the two techniques, one of marble, creating marble, the other one of creating a wood grain. We're going to start off by looking at marble because we're using marble as a surface texture for our column project. So if we're looking at our column project, this area, all this part of this cornice, all this molding and this column will all eventually be marble. There are many types of marble in the world, and so I have a paint decorations book here. So just to kind of show some examples here, we have marbles that range everything from yellow marbles, reddish marbles, all kinds of green marbles, all these different types of mineral, what we can classify as marble, come in a range of colors and beautiful textures. So your first step is to discover and find a sample of a marble that you can now use in your final project here. Okay, so what I have done is I have found a picture on the internet of a countertop marble. It's a standard kind of grayish white marble, more on the gray side. And what you want to do at first, the first step is you want to decipher what is the most appropriate approach to painting this. Now, what does that mean? So when we're painting marble, it's not that we take our paintbrush, dip into a bucket of paint, and just start painting. All right. What you'll end up with is a very flat surface, something that is very hard to control, and it will not look like marble. You'll be fighting it the whole time. So what we want to do is we want to think of this as a series of layers where you paint one particular painting technique, allow that to dry, paint another layer on top, and so forth until you have the overall look of marble. Marble has a tendency to have depth to it, meaning it feels like there are layers, like you could almost reach into it. Marble has a very beautiful that effect. So so we want to emulate that when we paint it. We want to create a process that is effective, is predictable, and that we can reproduce on stage in a very quick manner. You have to imagine that as a scenic artist, you're not like a oil painter or a artist working on your project at home. You are limited to a very selective time frame in order to paint an entire set, all the pieces, backdrops, flats, props, whatever is part of the scope of that project. You have a timeline. So we need to be very efficient in our processes for each of the different surfaces we're painting. So in the case of marble, if we were doing, say, an entire set for something like Lysistrata, which would be a lot of marble, we want to be able to create our process at the paint shop before we actually go to the finished built scenery. So if this was the painter's elevation that I had received from the set designer, I'm going to first really look at this and pick out, before I even think of color, I'm going to decide on the painting process that I think is going to best suit achieving this. Now, how do we do that? We need to kind of look at all of the different markings that are in this particular marble and decide, okay, what do I see that resembles the painting techniques that we've learned in class? Now, mind you, we've already learned scumbling, we've learned stippling, we've learned dry brush, we've learned rag rolling, we've talked about wet blending, we've talked about washes, we've talked about a whole number of different painting techniques, sponging, even flogging. So whenever I look at this, I want to look at different areas. I usually try to pick an area here, there, and see what is the strongest, the most predominant paint technique that I think it resembles. So as I look at this, I see a very milky area here, this very kind of flat area, but it's kind of wet looking. It looks like a puddle. So I'm going to think that there is probably some form of a wet blend or even a wash. Just plain a wash of color allows it to just kind of bleed where it wants to go. All right. So wash is one of my techniques. I'm going to write these down as I go so that we kind of get a feel for this. So I definitely see a wash. Okay, so this is one of them I see through the whole thing. As I look around, I also see these kind of amorphous kind of amoeba shapes. They're kind of all over the place, right? There's another one here. Now this reminds me of rag rolling. I see all of this. I might write down rag rolling. Okay, what else do I see here? All right, well, I see lots of little dots. There's dots here, there's dots here, there's dots here. All right, so there's dots over here. In our paint techniques, we achieve dotting in a couple different ways. We've got dots when we were stippling. Remember when we took our brush and just kind of dabbed in. We got dots whenever we took a sponge and lightly tapped. And we got dots when we were doing any kind of spatter painting as we were hitting our brush against a stick and allowed the droplets to come down. So I need to look at this and compare with my notes and say, which of these stippling, spattering, and sponging does this represent? Now, it could be a combination too. So at the moment, as I look at this, I think I could get away with, I don't think it's spattering. Now, normally I would use a lot of spatter. There may be a little bit, but I really think, you know what? I think I will do spattering, but I'm going to go with a more watery texture. I think because we have different types of dots, there's no pattern to it, but they look like droplets, like almost as if you dropped a drop of milk or a drop of sauce or something, and it creates this little tiny amoeba, a little bitty droplet shape. I'm going to use that as my spatter, as my droplets. All right, so we're going to go wet, a wet spatter. That's pretty good. All right, so the other thing I see are veins. Now this is what I always call the detail in props, or in scene painting here. When you see anything that is line work, anything that looks very linear, looks drawn, there's all kinds of line work here. That's going to be something that's more controlled. So I'm going to do some just line work. Now, how do we do lines? We can do it a couple of different ways. I could drag a brush. Now, most likely, I'm going to use one of my Fitch brushes, or one of my, in our project here, we're using round brushes in place of the larger Fitch brushes. But I'm going to take a liner, and I'm going to dip in the paint, and I'm going to hold the brush at the tip, and I'm going to drag through and just let it kind of wiggle to create our line work. All right. Now, with all of our marbles, they typically are going to be in a satin, semi-gloss, or gloss finish. That's the final coat, what gives it its sheen. All right, so sheen is the level of glossiness, okay, or lack of glossiness. So, like, remember our sheen categories are matte or flat, meaning there are zero sheen to it. We move up to something like eggshell, which is a little bit of sheen, slight. We go to satin, which has a nice finish. It is typically in the middle ground of shininess, still is kind of dull. Think of nickel, or certain plastics have sort of a satin finish. We have a semi-gloss, which is very comfortable. And then we have gloss, and then high gloss, which almost looks like it's wet, like there's water all over it, like a freshly washed car. It was very high gloss. All right, so we need to decide on what our sheen is. All right, So the sheen is typically going to be our finished material. And I like to use like a polyurethane or even one of our mediums. So if we use any of our mediums that is in a gloss or semi-gloss, we would add that on top. In the kits that I gave you, I did not give you any material that had a sheen to it. So for this, I want you to work on a glaze. Now, what is a glaze? A glaze is going to be using the medium I gave you, which is, in our case, is a flat glaze. And you can add a little bit of a white. Now, whenever I say a little bit, I mean a drop, a couple drops. It just needs to be a very slight wash. All right. So as I look through this, I can kind of see what my steps are. One, I'm going to do a wash, and then we'll let that dry. All right. Then I'm going to do a rag roll. I'm going to let that dry. I'm going to do a wet blend or wet spatter, I'm sorry, and let that dry. I'll do some line work, let that dry, and then I'm going to add my glaze. All right. I have 5 steps here. Now, something to be aware of when you're doing any kind of marble is that we have a tendency to have like areas like this washy area here, this big wet area that kind of looks like it's on top of the lines. Like this almost looks like there's a white line that goes through here and stops and then picks back up over here and over here. So I might do another glaze, sort of a milk kind of consistency of a white or a gray. In this case, it's a very gray color, and put that somewhere between 4 and 5. Okay. Now I'll illustrate that as we go. So it's basically allowing for another little washy layer to kind of help the whole thing feel like it's cohesive. All right. So here's our list here. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to do this as 5 and this is 6. So I have 6 different layers. We'll move on to the second step in just a second.